The wind howled across the endless Texas plains, carrying with it the dust of a land both beautiful and unforgiving. The year was 1872, and the frontier was no place for the faint of heart. Here, danger came not only from the wild animals that roamed the prairie, but from desperate men and the bitter conflict between settlers and the Comanche, who had long called this land their home. On the edge of this unforgiving wilderness stood a small homestead, little more than a cabin of rough-hewn logs and a corral that leaned with the weight of years. It belonged to Sarah Whitfield, a woman no older than 27, yet carrying herself with the quiet strength of someone who had endured far more than her years should have allowed. Sarah had come west with her husband Daniel, chasing the promise of land and freedom. But fate had been cruel. Daniel had been killed 2 winters before, thrown from his horse while hauling timber. Since then, Sarah had lived alone, battling loneliness, harsh weather, and the unspoken dangers that came with being a woman without protection on the frontier. Each day was a test of endurance. She rose before dawn to tend to her chickens, milk the single cow she owned, and work the soil that grudgingly gave her enough to survive. At night, when the coyotes howled in the distance, and the flicker of her oil lamp threw long shadows across the wooden walls, she often wondered if she had made a mistake staying. But leaving would mean abandoning everything she and her husband had built, and Sarah Whitfield was not a woman who surrendered easily. Beyond her cabin stretched miles of prairie, rolling grasslands that glowed gold in the morning and burned red at dusk. But the beauty of it could not hide the tension that gripped the land. Rumors of Comanche raids swept through every nearby settlement. Families spoke in hushed tones of stolen cattle, burned wagons, and riders vanishing on lonely trails. The settlers answered in kind. Posses of armed men rode out, searching for vengeance, sometimes chasing shadows, sometimes spilling blood where none was deserved. Each side saw the other as enemy, and mercy was a rare commodity. Sarah knew this better than most. The previous spring, her neighbor's family had been caught in the middle of such violence. 3 riders came back wounded, and her neighbor never came back at all. She had heard the gunfire from her porch that night, and the memory still haunted her. But in spite of the danger, Sarah refused to let fear rule her. She carried a rifle near the door, a pistol on her hip when she rode to fetch water, and a Bible that reminded her of Daniel's voice, steady and hopeful, even when times were hardest. As the sun dipped low one evening, streaking the sky in shades of crimson, Sarah paused from her chores and leaned on the fence rail, staring out at the horizon. Something stirred uneasily in her chest. It was the kind of silence that made the skin crawl, too heavy, too watchful. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes, a horse's hooves, distant shouts. Then, a single gunshot cracked like thunder across the open land. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand tightening on the fence post. Whatever it was close, too close, and in that instant, Sarah Whitfield knew her quiet, solitary life was about to collide with forces she had tried so hard to keep at bay. The frontier was a land of choices, hard choices. And before the night was through, Sarah would face one that would change her life forever. The night settled heavy on the prairie. Sarah Whitfield sat inside her small cabin, the flames of her oil lamp flickering against the wooden walls. She had bolted the door, as she always did, and laid her rifle across her lap. The echo of gunfire still lingered in her mind. Somewhere out there, men were chasing someone, or something, and the sound had been close enough to remind her how thin the line of safety was in this land. She told herself it was none of her concern. Best to stay inside, stay quiet, and let the danger pass her by. That was how she had survived so long. But as she sat listening, a sound reached her ears that she could not ignore. It was faint at first, the drag of boots or perhaps moccasins scraping against the earth. Then a thud, then silence. Sarah's breath caught. Slowly she rose, setting the lamp down, and moved to the door. She hesitated. Opening the door at night was never wise, but something urged her on. She slid the wooden bolt aside and eased the door open, her rifle raised. The cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of dry grass and smoke. At first she saw nothing. Then her eyes dropped to the ground in front of her steps. A man lay crumpled in the dirt. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped closer, the barrel of her rifle never wavering. The man was young, maybe no older than 25. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his shirt soaked with blood. His skin was sun-darkened, his hair long and braided, his features unmistakable. He was Comanche. Her first instinct was to retreat, to shut the door and leave him where he lay. The settlers spoke of Comanche with nothing but fear and hatred. Raiders, killers, horse thieves, men who burned homes and spared no one. And yet, as she stood there staring down at the broken figure before her, Sarah could not see a monster. She saw a man, wounded and near death, her conscience twisted inside her. If she left him, he would die before dawn. But if she took him in, she would be risking everything. If the posse returned and found him here, they would call her a traitor, perhaps worse. The man stirred, groaning softly, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. They were dark, sharp even through the haze of pain. He looked at her, confusion and defiance mingled together, and then his head slumped to the side. Sarah swallowed hard. She thought of her husband, Daniel, and the way he had always spoken of right and wrong as clear lines. "We don't get to choose the easy path, Sarah," he used to say. "We choose the righteous one, even if it costs us." Her grip tightened on the rifle. Then slowly she lowered it. Moving quickly, she crouched beside the warrior and slipped her arms beneath his shoulders. He was heavier than he looked, his body limp, but adrenaline gave her strength. Bit by bit, she dragged him across the threshold and into her cabin, the door shutting with a thud behind them. She laid him out on the floor near the hearth where the fire's warmth could reach him. His shirt was torn, a deep gash running across his ribs where a bullet had grazed him. Blood had soaked the cloth, staining it dark. Sarah fetched a basin of water, her hands trembling, and began cleaning the wound with strips of linen she tore from an old dress. The work was rough, she was no doctor, but she had learned enough tending to Daniel in the past. The warrior flinched when she pressed the cloth to his side, a faint growl escaping his lips, but he did not wake fully. She whispered under her breath, steadying herself as much as him. When she finally bound the wound tight, Sarah sat back on her heels, wiping the sweat from her brow. The man's breathing had steadied, though it was still shallow. He would live through the night, perhaps. A sudden knock rattled the door. Sarah froze, her heart lurching. She blew out the lamp in a single breath, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the faint glow of the fire. Another knock, louder this time. A man's voice called out, "Evening, Mrs. Whitfield. You seen any sign of a Comanche round here?" It was the posse. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The warrior lay unconscious just feet away. One glance inside would be enough to damn her. She rose, forcing her face into calm, and stepped to the door. Sliding the bolt aside, she opened it a crack. 3 men sat on their horses, rifles resting across their saddles. Their faces were grim, hard from the chase. "Gunfire carried this way," one of them said. "We're looking for a wounded buck. You seen anything suspicious?" Sarah's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the man's body behind her, the faint sound of his breathing. Lying was dangerous, but telling the truth was impossible. She gripped the door tighter. "No," she said evenly. "Ain't seen a thing, just me in the night." The men studied her face. The silence stretched like a rope pulled taut. At last, the leader tipped his hat. "All right then, but keep your rifle close. If you see something, you let us know." Sarah forced a smile. "I will." They turned their horses and rode off into the darkness. She shut the door quickly, sliding the bolt back into place. Her hands shook as she leaned against the wood, her chest heaving. Behind her, the Comanche stirred, his voice rasping faintly, in his own tongue. She turned to face him, the weight of her choice settling heavy on her shoulders. By saving him, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. and before long she would discover just how high the cost of that mercy could be. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier now, thick, almost suffocating. Sarah Whitfield leaned against the door, her palms damp with sweat. The posse's hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She turned toward the man lying on her floor. The Comanche warrior had shifted slightly, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the sharpness of his features, the strength hidden beneath the weakness of his wounds. He looked young, not much older than she was. Sarah's mind churned with fear and questions. Who was he? What had he done to earn the bullets of a posse? Had he raided some wagon or taken part in an attack? And, perhaps the darkest question of all, had she just saved the life of a man who might one day bring harm to her or to others she knew? But for now he was only a wounded soul clinging to life, and she could not bring herself to regret what she had done. Moving quietly, she fetched a fresh basin of water and set it beside him. The wound across his ribs had slowed its bleeding, but fever threatened. She dipped a cloth, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to his forehead. His skin was hot to the touch. He stirred, his eyes flickering open for just a moment. This time his gaze lingered on her. Dark, piercing eyes. Suspicious. Guarded but filled with something else too. Confusion. His lips moved and a word came out in a hoarse whisper she did not understand. Sarah shook her head softly. I don't know your tongue, she whispered back. But you're safe here. Rest. He seemed to study her for a heartbeat longer. Then his eyes slid closed again. Sarah sat back, exhaustion pressing down on her. She wanted nothing more than to crawl into her bed and pull the quilt over her head, but she knew she wouldn't sleep a wink. Not tonight. Instead, she settled into the chair by the hearth, rifle within reach, and kept watch. Hours dragged by, each one slower than the last. The cabin creaked in the wind. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls rising and falling like mournful voices. Once or twice she thought she heard riders again, but the sound faded quickly, leaving only her pounding heart. Inside, the Comanche muttered in his fevered dreams. At times his voice rose, speaking words she could not understand, sharp and clipped, like the cry of hawks. Once his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with startling strength. She nearly cried out, but when his eyes opened they were glazed with fever. He released her quickly, collapsing back against the floor. Sarah's fear mingled with pity. She thought of her husband again, how Daniel had once found an injured coyote pup tangled in barbed wire. The neighbors had told him to put it down, but Daniel had spent days nursing it back to health. All creatures deserve mercy, he had said. Even the ones we fear. It had been one of the many things she loved about him. Now remembering those words, she realized she had acted much the same. She had chosen mercy over fear, but as the hours crawled toward dawn, a new worry gnawed at her. What if the posse came back? What if they suspected her lie? If they stormed her cabin and found him here, they would show no hesitation in branding her a traitor to her own people. She could almost see their faces, their suspicion, their anger, the way their rifles would swing toward her. And what of the Comanche's own people? She knew enough to realize that if they learned she was harboring one of their warriors, they might not believe her intentions were pure. A lone white woman keeping one of their men in her home, it could be seen as a trick, a trap. Either way, her act of kindness might very well cost her her life. When the first gray light of morning crept through the cracks in the shutters, Sarah's eyes were raw from lack of sleep. She rose stiffly from her chair, her limbs aching, and checked the warrior's bandages. The wound had not worsened during the night. That was something. His fever, too, seemed to have broken slightly. As she replaced the cloth and settled the blanket around him, his eyes opened again. This time he seemed more aware, more focused. He studied her with a searching intensity, his lips pressing into a thin line. Sarah met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm of fear inside her. I don't know who you are, she said softly. But you're alive because I chose to help you. Remember that. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he gave a small nod. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, rising to her feet. She stepped to the door and peered out across the plains. The morning sun broke the horizon, painting the grass in gold. But her sense of peace was short-lived. Far in the distance, the faint rumble of hooves stirred the earth. She squinted, her heart sinking as she caught sight of figures riding fast, the glint of sunlight on weapons. This time, it was not the posse. It was the Comanche. And they were riding straight toward her cabin. The ground trembled beneath the pounding of hooves. Sarah gripped the doorframe, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the riders drew closer. Dust billowed up from the earth, the morning sun catching on dark hair, painted faces, and flashing weapons. Comanche. Her breath hitched. There were at least 24 of them, sweeping across the plain like a storm cloud. Their ponies moved with terrifying speed and grace, their war cries rising in the crisp air. It was a sight that would have made seasoned men turn pale. For Sarah, alone on her porch, it was enough to make her knees weaken. She turned quickly, shutting the door with trembling hands. The warrior she had tended still lay near the hearth, his body wrapped in the blanket she had placed over him. His dark eyes were open now, sharp and alert. He heard them too. Sarah's heart raced. What would they do when they saw her cabin? Would they think she had harmed one of their own? Would they believe the truth, that she had saved him? The pounding hooves grew louder, closer, until they circled the cabin. The shouts and cries of the riders pierced her walls, mingling with the thunder of hooves. Sarah's home, her one fragile refuge, was surrounded. She stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching her rifle. She knew she couldn't fight them. 20 against 1 was no fight at all. If they meant to burn her cabin, there was nothing she could do to stop them. The Comanche on the floor stirred, his gaze flicking toward the door. Then he looked at her. Slowly, with effort, he pushed himself upright, one hand pressed against his wound. Sarah shook her head, rushing to him. "You shouldn't move," but he silenced her with a sharp gesture. His expression was grim, his dark eyes commanding. He pointed to the door. She realized then what he intended. He would face his people himself. Sarah hesitated, then helped him to his feet. He swayed but steadied, squaring his shoulders despite the pain etched across his face. For the first time, she saw not just a wounded man, but a warrior. Proud, unyielding, every inch a leader even in his weakness. Outside, the pounding ceased. Silence pressed in, broken only by the snorts of horses and the creak of leather. Then a voice rang out, strong and commanding in the Comanche tongue. The man by her side answered, his voice raw but steady. Sarah held her breath. She couldn't understand the words, but she knew this moment would decide everything. Finally, the warrior stepped forward, pushing the door open. Bright sunlight spilled into the cabin as he stepped onto the porch, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support. Sarah followed, her rifle still in her hands, though she kept it lowered. Her eyes swept over the circle of riders that surrounded them. The Comanche were fierce in their war paint, their braids adorned with feathers, their eyes sharp and suspicious. One rider broke from the circle and dismounted. He was older, broader, with an air of authority that made the others defer to him. His gaze flicked from the wounded warrior to Sarah, his jaw tightening. He spoke in their language, a harsh string of words that carried the weight of command. The wounded warrior answered. Again his voice firm despite his weakness. He gestured towards Sarah, then pressed his hand to his side where the bandages wrapped him. The elder's eyes narrowed. His gaze turned to Sarah, piercing and unrelenting. She felt her pulse hammer in her throat. If they chose not to believe, their kinsman, if they thought she had harmed him, her life would be over within seconds. The silence stretched. The riders shifted restlessly, some gripping their spears tighter. Sarah forced herself not to move, not to raise her rifle. Then the elder stepped closer. He studied her face, her hands, the blood-stained cloth that still clung to her skirt. His expression softened slightly, just slightly. He turned and barked a command. The circle of warriors loosened. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't know exactly what had been said, but she knew one thing. She was still alive. The wounded warrior lowered himself carefully onto the porch steps, his breathing ragged but steady. His people dismounted, some kneeling by him, offering water, touching his shoulder with relief. But their eyes still flicked toward Sarah, filled with suspicion. She stood there, her rifle still in her hands, wondering what judgment would fall next. The elder spoke once more, this time pointing at her. His voice was unreadable, neither threatening nor kind. The wounded man answered again, this time softer, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah understood without needing to know the words. Whatever happened next, her fate was bound to his. The air outside the cabin was heavy with tension, as if the prairie itself held its breath. Sarah Whitfield stood rigid on her porch, rifle in her hands but lowered at her side. Around her, 24 Comanche warriors waited in a silence sharper than any battle cry. Their eyes never left her, some filled with suspicion, others with quiet hostility. The wounded man she had tended sat on the porch step, still leaning against the doorframe, his strength waning but his spirit unbroken. He spoke again, his words clipped and steady, directed at the older man who seemed to command. The others. The elder listened, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. When the younger warrior finished, the leader barked something short and sharp. 2 riders immediately dismounted and strode toward Sarah. Her heart lurched. She gripped her rifle instinctively, but before she could lift it, the wounded warrior raised his hand with surprising force. His voice cracked like thunder, halting the men in their tracks. The elder studied the exchange carefully, then stepped forward himself. He was close now, so close Sarah could see the streaks of gray in his hair, the deep lines carved by years of wind and war. His gaze swept over her, cold and piercing. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Sarah blinked, unsure. Was it a gesture of truce, or was he testing her? Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to lower her rifle. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, unyielding. For a long moment, the two stood locked in silence, 2 worlds colliding in that single touch. Finally, the elder released her hand and turned back to his men, speaking in their tongue. The warriors shifted, their postures relaxing ever so slightly. A few even lowered their weapons. The wounded man spoke again, this time in a softer voice, his hand pressing against his bandaged side. He gestured toward Sarah's cabin, toward the basin of water and bloodied rags still visible through the open doorway. His people followed his motion, their eyes narrowing with dawning understanding. Sarah realized he was telling them the truth, that she had saved his life. The elder's gaze returned to her, studying her face with renewed intensity. His voice rolled out, deep and commanding, as though he were asking a question. Sarah didn't know his words, but she felt the weight of them. It was as though the entire tribe demanded to know. Why? Her throat tightened. She could only answer, in the language she knew, hoping that her tone would carry what words could not. Because he would have died, she said softly, her voice trembling but clear, and I couldn't stand by and watch that happen. The elder's brow furrowed, but his eyes did not leave hers. He seemed to weigh her words, testing their sincerity. After a long silence, he gave a single nod. It was not approval, not forgiveness, but it was something. The tension around her loosened. Some of the warriors murmured among themselves, though their voices held more curiosity now than anger. The wounded man, her unexpected guest, looked at her with something almost like respect. Still, Sarah knew this was no guarantee of safety. She stood on the edge of a knife, her fate balanced on the thinnest of trust. The elder spoke again, his tone final, his eyes flicking between Sarah and the man she had saved. Whatever decision he made was accepted instantly by the others. They nodded, some mounting their horses again, others staying close to their injured comrade. The warrior she had tended reached for a water skin one of his people offered. After drinking, he turned to Sarah and, in halting English, rasped a single word: mercy. The sound of it hit her harder than any bullet. He had understood. He wanted her to know he understood. Her chest tightened with relief. And yet, beneath it all, fear still gnawed at her. Because mercy was not always enough to bridge the divide between two worlds at war. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Sarah realized this was only the beginning. She had passed their first test, but the true measure of trust had yet to come. The Comanche warriors lingered outside Sarah's cabin, their presence heavy against the morning sun. The elder gave orders in his tongue, and several dismounted, tending quickly to the wounded man she had cared for. They spoke in low tones, their hands skilled as they checked her bandages and replaced them with fresh hides and herbs from small pouches tied to their saddles. Sarah stood nearby, uncertain of whether to step forward or retreat. She clutched, her rifle tightly, though she kept it lowered. Fear gnawed at her stomach, yet alongside it was something else, an unsteady sense of wonder. These men who could so easily have burned her home to the ground were instead gathering quietly, their movements precise, their eyes casting furtive glances toward her. The elder spoke again, this time gesturing at her cabin. For an instant, Sarah thought they meant to search it, to take something, but instead one of the warriors brought forward a bundle wrapped in hide. He laid it on her porch and stepped back. Sarah blinked. Carefully, she crouched and unwrapped it. Inside lay strips of dried venison, a pouch of cornmeal, and a cured deer hide folded neatly. Supplies. A gift. Her breath caught in her throat. On the frontier, food and leather meant survival. She lifted her eyes to the elder, who stood watching her with a face carved in stone. He gave a short nod, acknowledgement, nothing more. But to Sarah, it meant far more than words. The wounded warrior shifted, propped against one of his kinsmen. He turned his gaze to her, his dark eyes meeting hers with that same piercing clarity she had seen when he first awoke. He spoke briefly in his language, his voice weaker now but steady. The elder listened, then answered. Several of the warriors murmured, some with nods of approval, others with wary looks. At last, the elder turned to Sarah once more. In halting English, his deep voice rumbled, "You, woman, you save him, not enemy." The words were rough, accented, but their meaning was clear enough. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She nodded. "I didn't want him to die," she said quietly. The elder studied her a moment longer, then raised his arm and motioned to his riders. One by one, they mounted their ponies, forming up in a wide circle again. But there was no threat in their movements now, only an air of solemnity. Before they departed, the elder looked to the wounded man. He spoke briefly, and the warrior nodded, his face set with determination despite the pain etched there. Then, to Sarah's surprise, the elder placed his hand over his heart and inclined his head ever so slightly toward her. It was not a bow, not submission, but it was respect. A recognition of her act. Sarah felt her knees weaken. She returned the gesture in the only way she knew, pressing her palm against her chest. The elder turned away, mounting his horse in a fluid motion. He barked another command and the riders began to move, their ponies carrying them swiftly across the plain. Within moments, the thunder of hooves grew distant, the dust settling back over the golden grass. Sarah remained on her porch, staring after them. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, her hands trembling as the silence of the prairie crept back in. Her gaze dropped to the bundle of supplies left behind. She reached out, running her fingers over the smooth deer hide, the pouch of cornmeal, the strips of venison, gifts of gratitude, or perhaps of warning. It struck her then. Her act of mercy had not only saved one man's life, but had altered something greater. The Comanche had come ready to judge her, to decide her fate. Instead, they had left her with food, hide, and perhaps most precious of all, a fragile thread of trust. Sarah sank onto the porch step, exhaustion pressing down on her. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel entirely alone on this wild frontier, and yet she knew the peace was delicate, a glass that could shatter with the smallest stone. The settlers in town would not see her act as noble. If they learned she had harbored an enemy, they might turn on her with equal fury. But as she sat there, the morning sun warming her face, Sarah realized she had chosen a path she could not regret. She had extended her hand across the gulf of fear, and against all odds the Comanche had extended theirs back. It was not friendship. It was not safety. But it was something she had never expected to find, an alliance born from mercy. And in the days to come, that fragile bond would mean more than she could possibly imagine. The prairie was still again. Only the faint prints of hooves in the earth remained to prove that 24 Comanche warriors had surrounded Sarah Whitfield's cabin that morning. Now as the sun climbed higher into the sky, its golden light washed over the small homestead, painting it in warmth that belied the storm Sarah felt inside. She sat on her porch steps, staring at the bundle of supplies left behind. Her fingers traced the rough deer hide, the strips of dried venison. These were not just gifts, they were symbols. Proof that for one brief moment, mercy had bridged the chasm between two worlds locked in endless conflict. Sarah's heart was still unsteady. The image of those fierce riders surrounding her home lingered in her mind. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, had stripped her bare. And yet, they had not harmed her. They had left her alive. More than that, they had left her stronger. She glanced at the cabin door, where faint stains of blood still marked the threshold. It would take days to scrub it clean, but she wondered if she ever wanted to. Those stains were a reminder of the choice she had made, a choice that had altered her fate. For years, settlers had spoken of the Comanche as monsters, shadows in the night who brought only fire and blood. But Sarah now knew something they did not. She had seen the humanity in one of their warriors, his pain, his strength, his gratitude. He had not been her enemy when he lay broken on her floor. He had been a man fighting to survive just as she was. Still, she understood the danger was far from over. If the posse returned and discovered the truth, she would be branded a traitor. Her name would be whispered with contempt in the settlements. She could be cast out, or worse. The settlers carried their own fury, and unlike the Comanche, they might not spare her for her mercy. But Sarah also knew she could never regret her choice. In the quiet of her heart, she heard her late husband's voice once more. "We don't get to choose the easy path. We choose the righteous one." That evening, she sat by her hearth as the fire cracked low. The cabin was quiet, but it no longer felt like the lonely prison it once had. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Comanche warrior she had saved was alive. Perhaps he rode with his people again, his body stronger, his spirit unbroken. And perhaps in some small way, he carried her kindness with him. Sarah lifted her Bible from the shelf, opening its worn pages. Her eyes lingered on a verse Daniel had once underlined, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." She closed the book, her hands trembling slightly. She did not know what the future held. She only knew that her act of mercy had planted a seed in ground hardened by hate. Whether it grew or withered was beyond her control. But it was there, alive, and that was enough. The days that followed brought whispers across the prairie. Some said the Comanche had spared a lone woman because of fear, others because of superstition. Only Sarah knew the truth, that it had been gratitude, respect, and something deeper that could not be easily explained. Weeks later, as autumn winds swept through the plains, she sometimes found signs near her cabin, fresh venison left hanging, by her corral, a bundle of herbs resting on her porch, small offerings, wordless messages from a people who spoke through actions rather than promises. Sarah never told anyone. The settlers would not have believed her, or worse, they would have condemned her. Instead, she carried the secret quietly, a fragile thread of connection between her world and theirs. One evening, standing on her porch, Sarah watched the horizon as the sun dipped low. The sky burned in shades of red and gold, the same as the night it all began. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the beat of her heart, strong and steady. She had survived. She had chosen compassion over fear. And because of that, she had not only saved a life, she had changed her own. The wind whispered across the grass, carrying with it echoes of hooves and voices that were no longer enemies in her mind. They were reminders, proof that even in the harshest of lands, mercy could break through the walls of hate. Sarah Whitfield stood tall on her porch, her gaze fixed on the endless plains. She was no longer just a widow clinging to survival. She was something more, a keeper of a fragile peace, a woman who had discovered that sometimes one act of mercy could echo louder than war. The prairie was still again. Only the faint prints of hooves in the earth remained to prove that 24 Comanche warriors had surrounded Sarah Whitfield's cabin that morning. Now as the sun climbed higher into the sky, its golden light washed over the small homestead, painting it in warmth that belied the storm Sarah felt inside. She sat on her porch steps, staring at the bundle of supplies left behind. Her fingers traced the rough deer hide, the strips of dried venison. These were not just gifts, they were symbols. Proof that for one brief moment, mercy had bridged the chasm between two worlds locked in endless conflict. Sarah's heart was still unsteady. The image of those fierce riders surrounding her home lingered in her mind. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, had stripped her bare. And yet, they had not harmed her. They had left her alive. More than that, they had left her stronger. She glanced at the cabin door, where faint stains of blood still marked the threshold. It would take days to scrub it clean, but she wondered if she ever wanted to. Those stains were a reminder of the choice she had made, a choice that had altered her fate. For years, settlers had spoken of the Comanche as monsters, shadows in the night who brought only fire and blood. But Sarah now knew something they did not. She had seen the humanity in one of their warriors, his pain, his strength, his gratitude. He had not been her enemy when he lay broken on her floor. He had been a man fighting to survive just as she was. Still, she understood the danger was far from over. If the posse returned and discovered the truth, she would be branded a traitor. Her name would be whispered with contempt in the settlements. She could be cast out, or worse. The settlers carried their own fury, and unlike the Comanche, they might not spare her for her mercy. But Sarah also knew she could never regret her choice. In the quiet of her heart, she heard her late husband's voice once more. We don't get to choose the easy path. We choose the righteous one. That evening, she sat by her hearth as the fire cracked low. The cabin was quiet, but it no longer felt like the lonely prison it once had. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Comanche warrior she had saved was alive. Perhaps he rode with his people again, his body stronger, his spirit unbroken. And perhaps in some small way, he carried her kindness with him. Sarah lifted her Bible from the shelf, opening its worn pages. Her eyes lingered on a verse Daniel had once underlined, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." She closed the book, her hands trembling slightly. She did not know what the future held. She only knew that her act of mercy had planted a seed in ground hardened by hate. Whether it grew or withered was beyond her control. But it was there, alive, and that was enough. The days that followed brought whispers across the prairie. Some said the Comanche had spared a lone woman because of fear, others because of superstition. Only Sarah knew the truth, that it had been gratitude, respect, and something deeper that could not be easily explained. Weeks later, as autumn winds swept through the plains, she sometimes found signs near her cabin, fresh venison left hanging, by her corral, a bundle of herbs resting on her porch, small offerings, wordless messages from a people who spoke through actions rather than promises. Sarah never told anyone. The settlers would not have believed her, or worse, they would have condemned her. Instead, she carried the secret quietly, a fragile thread of connection between her world and theirs. One evening, standing on her porch, Sarah watched the horizon as the sun dipped low. The sky burned in shades of red and gold, the same as the night it all began. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the beat of her heart, strong and steady. She had survived. She had chosen compassion over fear. And because of that, she had not only saved a life, she had changed her own. The wind whispered across the grass, carrying with it echoes of hooves and voices that were no longer enemies in her mind. They were reminders, proof that even in the harshest of lands, mercy could break through the walls of hate. Sarah Whitfield stood tall on her porch, her gaze fixed on the endless plains. She was no longer just a widow clinging to survival. She was something more. A keeper of a fragile peace, a woman who had discovered that sometimes one act of mercy could echo louder than war.